It started innocently late nights at the office, shared frustrations over deadlines, and casual jokes that became lingering glances. My boss, Hudson, was charming, confident, and everything my marriage had been missing lately. At first, it was harmless. I'd laugh at his jokes, he'd compliment my work, and we'd share knowing looks across the boardroom table. But there's a fine line between professional admiration and dangerous attraction, and I crossed it without even realizing it. My marriage wasn't bad, not in the catastrophic sense. My husband and I had settled into routine conversations about bills, groceries, and weekend plans. We'd become two people sharing a life rather than two people deeply in love. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at him while he was distracted, wondering if he noticed how far apart we'd drifted. But Hudson made me feel noticed, seen, desired. It started with those late-night meetings. The office would grow quiet as everyone else packed up and went home, leaving just the two of us under the fluorescent lights. Hudson would lean against my desk, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, and we'd talk about more than just work. He told me about his failed marriage, how his ex-wife had grown cold, how loneliness crept in even when you were surrounded by people. I told him about the silence at home, how my husband and I felt like strangers passing in the hallway. I remember the night everything shifted. It was raining, and we were the last two in the office again. I had been typing away, trying to finish a report, when Hudson brought me a cup of coffee. He sat on the edge of my desk, watching me with that knowing smirk of his. "You work too hard," he said softly. His hand brushed mine as he passed me the mug, and it lingered just a second too long. I felt my stomach twist in a way I hadn't felt in years. I should have pulled away. I should have ended it there, but I didn't. Instead, I looked up at him, and for a moment we just stared at each other. The tension was thick, electric, and undeniable. When he finally leaned in and kissed me, I didn't stop him. That kiss was the beginning of everything. At first, it felt manageable. We kept it to stolen moments in the office, after hours, a touch here, a glance there. But soon it wasn't enough. Hudson started booking hotel rooms. Fancy ones with dim lighting and crisp white sheets. I'd leave work early with a flimsy excuse, my heart racing as I drove to meet him. The guilt was there, gnawing at me every time I slipped my wedding ring into my purse before walking into the hotel lobby. But the guilt couldn't compete with the thrill. Hudson made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He'd pull me close, whisper things in my ear that made me blush, and look at me like I was the most important person in the world. When we were together, the rest of the world disappeared. But when I went home, reality came crashing back. My husband wasn't a bad man. In fact, he was kind, reliable, and steady. But that was the problem, everything felt steady. There were no sparks, no surprises, no excitement. I tried to push those thoughts away, to remind myself that love isn't supposed to be constant fireworks, but something softer, more stable. But when Hudson would text me late at night, "I can't stop thinking about you," it was impossible to resist. Over time, the affair started to take a toll on me. I was exhausted from living a double life, constantly looking over my shoulder and overthinking every word I said to my husband. Sometimes he'd ask me, "You've been working late a lot lately. Everything okay?" I'd force a smile and nod, brushing off his concern with some excuse about deadlines or demanding clients. But deep down, I knew he could sense something was off. I told myself it was temporary. That eventually I'd stop. That one day I'd wake up, end things with Hudson, and patch up the cracks in my marriage. But the truth was, I was in too deep. I craved the way Hudson made me feel desired, wanted, alive. And so I kept pushing boundaries, ignoring the little voice in my head screaming at me to stop. The hotel rooms became our escape, a bubble where the outside world couldn't reach us. Hudson would pour wine, we'd laugh, and for a few hours everything felt perfect. But perfection doesn't last, and secrets always have a way of coming to light. There was one moment weeks before everything fell apart that still haunts me. Hudson and I were lying in bed after spending the afternoon together. He was tracing circles on my shoulder, his voice low and relaxed. "Do you ever think about leaving him?" he asked. I froze. I hadn't allowed myself to think about it, not seriously. "No," I said softly, but the hesitation in my voice betrayed me. Hudson didn't push, but the question lingered in the air. What if I did leave? What if I walked away from my marriage and took a chance on this reckless, dangerous thing we had? But deep down, I knew I never would. My husband was a good man, and despite everything, I still loved him, or at least the version of him I had loved once. But love wasn't enough to stop me from continuing down this path, even as it became clearer that there was no way this would end well. The guilt became harder to suppress. Every smile from my husband felt like a knife to the chest. Every time he kissed me goodbye in the morning, I wondered if he could taste the betrayal on my lips. But no matter how heavy the guilt felt, I kept going back to Hudson. I had convinced myself that I was in control, that I could stop whenever I wanted, that I could keep the two parts of my life separate, but affairs don't stay neat and tidy. They unravel, and when they do, they take everything down with them. I didn't know it then, but the night my husband called Hudson was coming. The moment where everything would shatter, where my carefully constructed facade would crumble around me. But for now, I was still tangled in sheets that weren't mine, with a man who wasn't my husband, believing the lie that I could keep this under control. We were tangled together in bed when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The faint vibration against the wooden surface felt distant, almost unimportant. I ignored it, letting the sound dissolve into the hazy atmosphere of the dimly lit hotel room. Hudson's arm was draped lazily over me, his face buried in my neck as he chuckled at something I had said just moments before. Everything felt unreal, like a dream I knew I shouldn't be having but couldn't wake up from. Then Hudson's phone rang. The sound was sharp and jarring, slicing through the soft, intimate silence like a knife. He groaned as he reached for it, glancing at the screen before smirking and answering. His casual confidence was something I had always found intoxicating, but in that moment it felt misplaced. I could feel it, the change in the air, the weight of something sinister settling over us. Hudson pressed the phone to his ear and leaned back against the headboard, his smirk widening as he spoke. But the moment he turned on speakerphone, my stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. My husband's voice came through, steady and calm, but layered with something lethal underneath. "You've got 3 seconds to get your stuff out of my wife, or I'll cut your private part in half. Twice." Time froze. The words hung heavy in the air, and I felt my body go numb. My breath caught in my throat, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Hudson, to my disbelief, laughed. A short, dismissive sound, like he was hearing an empty threat from a stranger on the street. "Screw you," he said casually, shaking his head as if this was some kind of joke. But it wasn't. I knew my husband. I knew the weight his words carried, and I knew his voice when he wasn't bluffing. He wasn't a man who threw around empty threats, not with his history, not with his training. My husband had spent years in the Middle East as a sniper. He was a man who had stared death in the face and didn't flinch. The reality of the moment hit me like a freight train. My chest tightened and panic bloomed in my stomach, spreading like poison through my veins. This wasn't just an argument or a heated moment of jealousy. This was life or death, and Hudson didn't understand that. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words died on my tongue. And then it happened, a loud, sharp blow. It wasn't a gunshot, not quite, but it was loud enough to make Hudson flinch. His smirk faded instantly, replaced by wide-eyed confusion and fear. We both froze, staring at each other, neither of us daring to breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Somewhere deep in my mind, a thought clawed its way to the surface. He's here. My husband is here. Hudson scrambled out of bed, his bravado cracking as reality set in. He stumbled as he pulled on his pants, his fingers fumbling with the buttons in his panic. I was paralyzed, clutching the sheets to my chest as if they could shield me from whatever was coming. The silence after the blow was suffocating. Every creak of the building, every distant sound of traffic outside felt amplified, magnified by the fear pounding in my head. I could barely process what was happening. My husband had found us. He had called Hudson. He was close, maybe outside the hotel room, maybe watching us through a scope from somewhere nearby. Hudson looked at me, his face pale and his usual cocky demeanor completely gone. I gotta go," he stammered, grabbing his jacket from the floor. And just like that, he was gone. The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone in that cold, sterile room, surrounded by crumpled sheets and the suffocating scent of betrayal. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My husband's voice replayed in my head over and over again, each syllable carving itself into my mind. "You've got 3 seconds," the precision in his tone, the calm certainty it wasn't something you could fake. My husband was a man who only spoke when he meant every word. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. I was still frozen in the same spot when I realized I needed to leave. The hotel room suddenly felt like a trap, like the walls were closing in on me. I pulled on my clothes with trembling hands, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I tried to steady myself. The walk through the hotel hallway felt endless. Every corner felt like a threat, every shadow a figure waiting to jump out at me. When I stepped outside into the night air, I scanned the parking lot, half expecting to see my husband standing there, rifle in hand, staring me down with those cold, calculating eyes. But he wasn't there. The drive home was a blur. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, convinced I was being followed. I expected to see headlights tailing me, or worse, my husband's face in the back seat. But the roads were empty, and the silence was unbearable. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. No lights on, no sign of my husband's car. I sat in the driver's seat for what felt like an eternity, staring at the front door and trying to gather the courage to go inside. Part of me expected him to be waiting for me, sitting calmly in the living room with his sniper rifle propped against the wall. But when I stepped inside, the house was empty. The silence felt different now, heavier, more oppressive. I walked through each room, my heart hammering with every creak of the floorboards. But there was nothing. No notes, no messages, no sign of him at all. That was almost worse than seeing him. The uncertainty of it all, the feeling that he could be anywhere, watching, waiting, was suffocating. My husband wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide. He wasn't impulsive and he wasn't reckless. If he wasn't here, it meant he was planning something. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands, and let out a shaky breath. My chest ached from the weight of everything, the guilt, the fear, the realization that nothing would ever be the same again. The loud blow from earlier echoed in my mind again, and I couldn't stop asking myself, was that a warning shot? Or was it something worse? One thing was clear, this wasn't over, it was just beginning. The silence in the house was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint hum of the refrigerator, every distant noise from outside made me flinch. My husband was nowhere to be seen, but his presence lingered like a shadow in every corner of every room. I sat on the couch for what felt like hours, my arms wrapped tightly around myself as if I could hold my fractured world together. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me until I felt like I might break under it. I couldn't stop replaying his voice in my head, the calm precision, the edge of something unyielding and dangerous lurking beneath his words. My husband had been trained to keep his composure under the most extreme circumstances, and that phone call wasn't made in anger, it was made with intent. It wasn't a warning, it was a promise. The loud blow I'd heard earlier haunted me, clawing at the edges of my sanity. Had it been a warning shot? Had someone gotten hurt? Had Hudson made it out of the hotel safely? Or had my husband already gotten to him? I pulled my knees to my chest, trying to push the images out of my mind, but they just kept flooding back, flashes of Hudson laughing, of my husband's icy voice, of blood splattered across sterile white hotel sheets. I needed answers, but the thought of picking up my phone felt impossible. I didn't know what I would find. Would Hudson text me? Call me? Would my husband leave a message? Or worse, what if there was nothing at all? The not knowing was like a slow, torturous drip of water on my skull. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I needed something, water, a distraction, anything to stop the thoughts from consuming me whole. My legs were shaky as I walked to the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the tiled floor. The glass shook in my hands as I filled it with water, and when I brought it to my lips, I realized my teeth were chattering. I stared out the kitchen window into the darkness beyond. My husband could be out there right now, watching me from the shadows. He was a sniper, after all, patient, methodical, invisible until it was too late. The thought made my stomach twist violently, and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. Hours passed, though they felt like an eternity. The house remained silent, the walls closing in on me with every passing second. I considered calling someone, a friend, a family member, but what would I even say? I cheated on my husband, he caught me, and now I'm terrified he's going to do something unforgivable. There was no version of this story that wouldn't end with my life in ruins. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear. My body felt heavy, my mind foggy, and I stumbled upstairs to the bedroom. Our bedroom. The place where my husband and I had once been happy, once been in love. I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the bed we used to share. The same bed where I had once felt safe, where I had once believed we could weather any storm together. I crawled under the covers, fully dressed, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. The weight of sleep pulled at me, but every time I started to drift off, I would jolt awake, my pulse racing and my breath coming in shallow gasps. I kept expecting to hear the front door creak open, to hear heavy footsteps climbing the stairs, to see the shadow of my husband standing in the doorway. When I finally fell asleep, it wasn't peaceful. My dreams were a mess of tangled sheets, loud bangs and Hudson's laughter turning into screams. I woke up drenched in sweat, the early morning light filtering weakly through the curtains. My phone buzzed beside me, and my stomach dropped as I saw Hudson's name flash across the screen. I hesitated before answering, my thumb hovering over the screen. When I finally picked up, his voice came through, low and unsteady. "Are you okay?" he asked. The sound of his voice was both a relief and a dagger to the chest. He was alive, that much was clear, but he sounded shaken, unlike the confident man I had been tangled up with hours ago. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice cracking. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I think your husband was there last night. After I left the hotel, I felt like I was being followed. I drove around for hours before going home. I haven't slept." His words confirmed what I already knew deep down. My husband had been watching us. He had seen everything, and he had been close. Too close. "What are we going to do?" I asked, though I wasn't even sure who I was asking, Hudson, myself, or some unseen force that might somehow fix this mess. Hudson didn't have an answer. His silence said more than words ever could. After we hung up, I sat frozen in place. My husband hadn't come home, he hadn't called, he hadn't done anything. That silence was more terrifying than anything else. My husband was deliberate, calculated, he wasn't impulsive, and he wasn't reckless. If he wasn't confronting me, if he wasn't raging or throwing things, it meant he was planning something. The hours ticked by, and still, there was nothing. I paced the house, jumping at every noise, every shadow that moved across the windows. I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but wait. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my car keys and left the house. I needed to drive, to escape the suffocating silence. The streets were empty as I drove aimlessly, my hands trembling on the wheel. My husband's voice replayed over and over in my head like a mantra I couldn't escape. When I pulled into a gas station to clear my head, I caught sight of a car parked across the lot. A familiar car. My husband's car. He was sitting in the driver's seat, his head turned slightly, as if he was watching me. Even from a distance, I could see the sharp line of his jaw, the stillness of his posture. He wasn't moving, wasn't reacting, just sitting there staring. A wave of cold dread washed over me. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and for a moment I thought I might be sick. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then, just as calmly as he had appeared, he started his car and drove away. No words, no gestures, no acknowledgement, just silence. But that silence said everything. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The drive back home after seeing my husband at the gas station felt like a descent into something dark and unrecognizable. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and my breathing came in sharp, uneven gasps. He had been there, just sitting in his car watching me. Not a word, not a gesture, just silence. But that silence was louder than any scream. It carried a weight, a promise, and it clung to me like a shadow as I made my way back to the house. The house felt colder than before, emptier somehow, as if the walls had absorbed the tension from my body and were now mirroring it back at me. I locked the door behind me, double-checking every bolt and latch, though I knew that if my husband wanted to get in, no lock in the world would stop him. I dropped my keys on the counter and leaned against it, my head hanging low as I tried to steady my breathing. I couldn't stop thinking about his face, the way he had stared at me from his car. He hadn't been angry, not outwardly. There was no wildness in his eyes, no obvious rage, and that terrified me more than if he had screamed and broken something. Anger burns out, but calm, calculated silence, that lingers, festers, grows into something far worse. The sound of my phone buzzing snapped me out of my thoughts. I lunged for it, half expecting to see his name on the screen, but it wasn't him. It was Hudson. His name alone sent another wave of anxiety crashing over me. I hesitated before answering, my voice trembling when I spoke. "Did you see him again?" Hudson's voice was low, almost cautious. "Yes," I whispered. "At a gas station. He was just sitting there watching me." There was a pause on his end, and I could hear him exhale sharply. "He's not going to let this go," he said quietly, and his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. We didn't talk much after that. There was nothing left to say. We were both tangled in the consequences of our choices, and no amount of conversation would change what had already been set in motion. After we hung up, I turned my phone off. I couldn't handle the weight of another call, another message. The hours dragged on, each one stretching endlessly into the next. I couldn't eat. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every shadow in the corner of the room felt like him. Every creak of the house sounded like his footsteps. I moved from room to room, turning on every light, as if that could somehow chase away the crushing guilt and fear coiling inside me. At some point, exhaustion caught up with me. I collapsed onto the couch, pulling a blanket tightly around me. My body was trembling, and my mind was a whirlwind of fractured thoughts and memories. My husband's voice on the phone, Hudson's smirk in the hotel room, the loud blow that still echoed in my ears. Sleep came, but it wasn't restful. My dreams were fragmented and chaotic, filled with distorted images and muffled screams. When I woke up, the room was dark and the house was silent. I sat up abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest as I scanned the shadows around me. Something felt wrong. The air was heavy, suffocating, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement outside the window. I froze, holding my breath as I stared into the darkness. But there was nothing. Just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I forced myself to stand and walk to the window, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. My breath fogged up the glass as I peered outside, but the yard was empty. Still, the unease wouldn't leave me. My husband was out there, I could feel it in my bones. Whether he was watching from the shadows or waiting for the perfect moment to strike, I couldn't say. But he was there. The next day passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. Every hour that went by without hearing from him felt like another drop in an already overflowing bucket of fear. I tried to distract myself, cleaning, organizing, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. By evening, I was pacing the living room, clutching my phone in one hand as I stared at the front door. I wanted him to call. I wanted him to call. I wanted him to storm through the door and scream at me, throw things, demand answers. Anything would have been better than this silence, this waiting, this not knowing what was coming next. When the knock came at the door, it was so soft I almost didn't hear it. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze in place. Another knock followed, louder this time, and my breath hitched. Slowly, I crept to the door, peering through the peephole. It wasn't my husband. It was a police officer. I opened the door with trembling hands, my voice shaking as I spoke. Is everything okay? The officer's face was solemn, his eyes sharp as they met mine. Ma'am, we received an anonymous tip. Someone reported hearing what sounded like a gunshot near your home a couple of nights ago. We're just following up. My stomach dropped. A gunshot. The loud blow from that night in the hotel, it hadn't been a warning shot. It hadn't been some random noise. It had been real, and now the police were here, asking questions. I don't know anything about that, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The officer studied me for a moment before nodding. All right, if you think of anything or if anything happens, you have my card. He handed me a small piece of paper, then turned and walked back to his patrol car. I closed the door and leaned against it, the card clutched tightly in my hand. My vision blurred as tears welled in my eyes and I slid down to the floor, my knees pulled to my chest. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was something I couldn't bear to face. My husband was still out there, still watching, still planning. And whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be mercy. It wasn't going to be forgiveness. It was going to be the reckoning I had been dreading since the moment his voice crackled through that phone call. This wasn't over. It was only getting started. The hours after the officer left felt like they bled into days, and the days felt like they stretched into weeks. Time lost all meaning, and I existed in a fog of paranoia and exhaustion. My husband's silence was unbearable, but it was also deliberate. He was out there somewhere, planning his next move. Every sound became a threat, every shadow a figure lurking in the dark. I barely ate, barely slept, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of Hudson's face, my husband's voice on the phone, and the imagined aftermath of that gunshot echoing in my mind. I had started jumping at the smallest noises, footsteps on the sidewalk, car engines starting outside, even the ticking of the clock on the wall. The house, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every corner felt sharp, every room filled with suffocating air. I kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, but none of it felt like enough. My husband had become a ghost, haunting me with his silence, his patience, and the inevitability of whatever he was planning. At some point, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the weight of my fear was becoming unbearable. I packed a small bag, just enough clothes for a few days, my phone charger, and some cash. I didn't have a plan, didn't have a destination in mind. I just knew I had to leave. But as I stood at the front door, bag slung over my shoulder and keys clutched tightly in my hand, a sick realization washed over me. He could be out there, watching. Leaving might not save me, it might provoke him. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob as my chest tightened and my vision blurred with tears. Was there any way out of this? Or was I trapped no matter what I did? Eventually, I decided to stay. Running wouldn't solve anything, it might only make things worse. I set my bag down by the door and sank to the floor, pressing my forehead against my knees as silent sobs racked my body. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, letting the fear and guilt consume me. When I finally pulled myself together, I decided to check my phone. I had kept it turned off for days, too afraid of what messages or missed calls might be waiting for me. With trembling fingers, I powered it on and waited as the screen flickered to life. There were no messages from my husband, no missed calls, just silence. But there was one message from Hudson. "We need to talk. Please call me." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. I didn't want to call him, didn't want to hear his voice. Hudson felt like a loose thread in a fabric already unraveling, and the thought of pulling at it terrified me. But the curiosity, the need for answers won out. When he picked up, his voice was low and tense. "Are you okay?" I didn't answer the question. "What's going on, Hudson?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Someone's been watching me, following me. I think it's him." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had assumed my husband's silence meant he was focused on me, that I was the target. But now I realized he was playing a much bigger game, moving pieces on a chessboard that I couldn't even see. "Hudson, what if he's planning something? What if?" He cut me off. "I don't know, but I'm scared. I can't sleep, I can't eat, I feel like he's everywhere." We spoke for a few more minutes, but neither of us had answers, only fear and regret that wrapped around our words like chains. When we hung up, I felt hollow. My husband wasn't just coming after me, he was circling Hudson too. The weight of the consequences was finally settling in. There was no escaping this, no undoing what had been done. My husband was out there, and he wasn't going to stop until he was satisfied, whatever that meant. That night, I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. The street was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, my phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have fallen asleep in the chair. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. My heart leapt into my throat as I glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen before I finally answered. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. And then, a voice. My husband's voice. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" The words were calm, deliberate, and colder than ice. My breath caught in my throat as my vision blurred with tears. "I trusted you," he continued. "I gave you everything, and you threw it all away." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. "Don't worry," he said softly. "This isn't over yet." Not even close. The line went dead, and I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. My entire body was trembling, my chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He had finally spoken. After days of silence, of waiting, of torment, he had finally spoken. And somehow that was worse than the silence. I sat frozen in place for hours, replaying his words over and over in my mind. My husband wasn't going to forgive me. He wasn't going to forget. Whatever was coming next, I knew one thing for certain: it wasn't going to end well. The night stretched on, the darkness pressing against the windows like an intruder trying to force its way inside. And as the minutes turned into hours, I realized something horrifying. I wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere.